Welcome to Community Roundtable. I'm Nic Burns from the Salt Lake Community College Communication Department. I'll be your host this season as we explore topics of special interest and concern to the residents of all the cities and unincorporated areas of Salt Lake County. Topics equally important to the general public throughout Utah. We're recording this show just prior to the start of the 2013 Utah legislative session, and we think an ideal topic is lobbying. What is it? What are the benefits of lobbying? And for whom? Plus, we want to look at the downside of lobbying. Joining me around the table today to give us their perspectives on the lobbying process, former Utah State Senator Carlene Walker. She has, for sure, met her share of lobbyists. And across from her, Lincoln Shurtz from the Utah League of Cities and Towns. They are a nonpartisan government cooperative. They work to strengthen the quality of local government and local administration. Let's start off the discussion today by noting that last year, during the legislative session, we had 4 registered lobbyists for every legislator on the Hill. On the one hand, lobbying is open to everyone who wants to let their elected leaders know what they think. On the other hand, lobbying has been called legalized bribery. So Carlene, let's start with you. What are your thoughts on the process overall in terms of lobbying here in Utah?
I believe that lobbying is an education process. As a new legislator, when I was first elected to the Senate, I had a bundle of very general experiences and a few specifics from jobs that I had had and things that I had done. But I was immediately put in as chairman of the political subdivisions, and Lincoln was one of the first lobbyists that ever approached me because I chaired a committee that oversaw his association and the cities and counties of the state. And I had never been a city or a county official, as many of the legislators have been mayors and city councilmen.
Sure.
I have not. This was my first elected office. And I needed that education. I needed that background. And a good lobbyist is an educator.
You make it sound so benign, whereas the public has such a negative view often.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think lobbyists, the typical opinion of a person on the street is that of a contract lobbyist who makes big money and who has many, many clients, many different hats. And it's my opinion that the PTA mom that calls you or emails you is also lobbying your legislator. They aren't being paid, but they are lobbying. They are asking you for your vote.
Right. Those PTA moms and soccer dads and whatnot don't have the ability to invite all 100 legislators to lunch, but they're still lobbying.
Absolutely. And I really believe that all, or many, the vast majority of the legislators are impacted every bit as much by the person, their neighbor that comes and asks them, or their PTA president that comes and asks them for the vote in a certain way, as they are by a lunch. And I will tell you that during the heat of a legislative session, I would have given my eye teeth for a Cobb salad in a closet as opposed to a steak lunch with a dozen lobbyists talking at me.
So Lincoln, at the League of Cities and Towns, you're the Director of Legislative Affairs. That makes you their lobbyist?
Pseudonym for lobbyist, that's correct.
But you don't use that word, so is that because of the sort of spin and connotation of the word?
Not necessarily. In addition to lobbying, we focus on doing government affairs at the local government level as well, so coordinating the efforts of other local governments throughout the state of Utah, working with our membership. So directing that entire effort, which does include lobbying, is kind of the larger title that's included in the job description.
So you're not always up on the Hill?
I'm not always on the Hill. I have my background in economics, started off with the League of Cities and Towns doing economic research for city government so that they could better administer local government, and that kind of melded into lobbying.
So the concern over lobbying certainly has risen over the last few years with the federal Supreme Court Citizens United decision and whatnot, but your league is, what, 100 years old?
It is. It's about 105 years old.
This isn't really anything new then?
It is not anything new. We've been doing this for about 60 years when really lobbying started to take effect in the state legislature. And to really emphasize some of Carlene's points, I think most citizens look at lobbyists and think of K Street in Washington, D.C. lobbying and Congress, where you have a full-time Congress or legislative body, and you have professional lobbyists that's what they do day in and day out. When you look at state governments, and most news organizations don't focus as much on state organization, they're lay legislators. These are folks who have professions outside of their legislative service. They aren't professionals in government. So having lobbyists and folks that can come and educate them about specific issues is an important part of the process. Certainly there are issues that come with lobbying and the perception of undue influence, and I think the legislature's taken significant strides to try and limit that perception and make sure that the citizenry has confidence in the process.
I know there's Utahns for ethical government, and there's groups trying to curtail even more. I wonder, though, when you say a state like ours has the lay legislative, they're lawyers, attorneys, developers, whatever, the rest of the year, do you think, and I don't mean to sound overly negative, but are they riper for the plucking, so to speak, from the professional registered lobbying folks?
To a certain extent, I think they're more there is this need for information, and the easiest place to get some of that information, as Carlene mentioned, is from folks who have a certain expertise in a specific field. As Carlene mentioned, I spent a lot of time with the Political Subdivisions Committee because local governments are political subdivisions of the state. And certainly that allows me to have an access and portray my side of the story. I do think it's important that when I do go up and talk to a legislator, I say what I'm there for. They know what my background is, and they know what angle I'm pushing. So from that standpoint, it is not lost on them that I have an agenda.
They should know you.
Exactly.
So Carlene, you mentioned that the PTA mom or the dad who works at the box factory or whatever, they're all lobbyists too. And I'm a professor here, and I've certainly contacted my elected officials. What distinctions or differences do you see between those citizen lobbyists and the registered hired guns, aside from the fact you mentioned representing multiple clients? What other differences do you see?
Well, it's interesting. When I was in the legislature, and actually since, people have come to me and said, how can I have an impact? And my advice is always to organize people that are like-minded. And there is strength in numbers. And if you have Citizens for Ethical, whatever, government, they organized. They were very organized. They had some leaders that were very aggressive. They pulled in people. They've petitioned, and I think that that individuals can have an impact. For instance, I have had some constituents with disabled children, and they would bring their child in and sit down, make an appointment, and I would talk to them. And I would sometimes go to their homes, and I would see the impact that these children have had on this family and the help that they need. Now, they certainly did not give me anything, did not offer me anything. I took my time, and generally it was in the off season where I would spend time in their home, and that is every bit as impactful as an organized lobbyist.
I got to break in real quick here, and I want to get back to that notion. We do need to take a break now. This is Community Roundtable, talking with former Senator Carlene Walker and Lincoln Shurtz from the League of Cities and Towns, and we'll be right back with more Community Roundtable. We are back on Community Roundtable, talking with former Senator Carlene Walker and Lincoln Shurtz from the League of Cities and Towns. And this notion of individual citizens, I mean, that is participatory democracy. But it's also true, Lincoln, that the average contract lobbyist, registered lobbyist in Utah makes about $100,000 a year. And I don't know if that's you, but with 400 up on the Hill registered, how do the contracted lobbyists, even like yourself, how do you even get heard in that kind of cacophony of voices?
Well, the distinction that I think we were trying to get at earlier between a citizen lobbyist and a contract lobbyist, the legal distinction is this. If you're being paid by someone to lobby on their behalf, you're considered a lobbyist, and you have to register. If a mother of a child with a disability, or for instance last year there were several mothers that came up with children with autism trying to push to ensure that there was an insurance mandate included in the insurance laws came up, they do not have to register to lobby because they're lobbying on their own behalf, and it's essentially their ability and their right under the Constitution to redress government. So from that standpoint, that's the legal distinction that's in place. When you talk about the 400 or 500 registered lobbyists that are on Capitol Hill, of those there are probably 15 to 20 professional contract lobbyists out of that group. The rest will either be association lobbyists, or they'll be citizen lobbyists, or interest group lobbyists. And when I say interest group lobbyists, those are folks like conservative think tanks or other interest groups, environmental groups that may have a lobbying arm of the organization that they send up to the Capitol as well.
So in other words, those lobbyists would be more like yourself, representing one group, one interest,
Correct.
as opposed to someone who's a hired gun who might be representing 5 different groups.
10 to 12 different clients. Correct.
So about those folks, you know, you mentioned we could talk about the Utah Education Association or the Eagle Forum or the Sutherland Institute. It seems to me those groups, both on the lobbying front, but also in the media, have this vast power to sort of set an agenda that the individual citizen lobbyists have no power to come anywhere near. And that balance seems mighty unfair, at least to me.
Well, when you mentioned the Eagle Forum, and I always argue when I talk about this issue that Gail Rosico is probably one of the most successful lobbyists on Capitol Hill, and she is just a citizen. She's organized a group of individuals as a citizen. She's not getting paid to lobby. The Eagle Forum is not a group that is paying contract lobbyists to go out and do this. This is a group of citizens that have successfully organized to come up and redress their government.
But because they are an organized group, they have a vast ability. When she speaks, it gets in the paper.
Absolutely.
When those moms and dads who called you to visit their homes with their, you know, children with disabilities, the newspapers aren't following them around. So to me, there seems to be an unbalance.
And today there's a new group out, and it's called the Mothers for Clean Air. They didn't exist 2 years ago.
Oh, exactly.
It's the same sort of organizational effort that if you actually put the effort in as a normal citizen, it's amazing the impact you can have in the legislative process.
And that's what I was
Carlene.
saying in terms of recommending when someone comes to me and says, how can I have an impact? Organize like-minded people, and you really can have an impact. You know, you do emails, you do phone calls, you do letters, and there are techniques that are definitely more impactful than others.
Take me through some. What works? I mean, what worked to get your attention?
Well, hard copy letters were very difficult because legislators do not have secretaries, and so to respond to that is very difficult. You know, you'd have to sit down with your letterhead and type. So I always said, don't bother with the hard copy letters. Emails for me were the most impactful. And at the time when I first went into the legislature, there were some of the older legislators that I will not name who did not like email. They were the older veterans who had lived through the hard copy. They had their books. You know, the rest of us all used our computers, and so to me, email was the most effective. Because when I would get time to answer my emails, and I personally answered them all because I didn't want my next door neighbor to email me about an issue and have them have a canned response from my intern. So I answered my emails, and it was often 2 a.m. when I did
Sure.
that. So to be able to maximize your day, and believe me, the legislators have very, very long days, and it is often in the middle of the night when they sit down. And so to have an email rather than a phone calls I thought were also very difficult to try and track somebody down. They had to track me down, and I had to track them down to respond. And so to me, emails were the most important.
And I presume personal emails, not click a form.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. Not fill in the blank, you know. Speak from the heart, speak from why you feel it is, because we would get literally hundreds of emails a day. I would say, tell them you're a constituent, put a good subject line. This is about, and not just a bill number, but a bill title or subject, because we have hundreds of bills. We can't keep bill numbers, other than there's a handful of bills every year that you know what the number is. But otherwise, I couldn't even, I usually carried about a dozen bills a year, and I couldn't keep track of my own numbers, let alone everybody else's. So put in a good subject line, and then say, Dear Senator Walker, I am your constituent, and I have a great concern about this issue, and this is why, and try and personalize it.
So make it personal. Keep it short, I presume.
Keep it short, bullet points, you know, and that's another thing. When you either email or you hand out something on the Hill, if you personally go up, do bullet points. I mean, don't give paragraphs.
Right,
I mean,
okay.
A one page,
short and sweet.
Even a half a page with bullet points, so that you can scan it.
So Lincoln, are you doing emails or you're up there person to person, in person?
Both.
Both, okay.
Obviously representing local governments. We represent 250 cities in the state of Utah. So we organize that group of individuals when we have common interest to make sure that they are talking to their local legislators. I would say that the biggest issue that most citizens think is the hindrance or the inability to affect change on an individual level is they think lobbyists have all the money that they're doling out and that gives them the undue influence. What I think probably the biggest issue is most citizens are intimidated by the process. It's a very fast-moving process. It's an intimidating building. For most people, it's intimidating to get up and speak in front of a large group, and that's part of the governmental process. So from that standpoint, when you can imagine 1,000 pieces of legislation being introduced in a 45-day session, of which they work 35 of those days, things are moving very fast. And if you don't understand the process, I would assume most citizens get intimidated by that process. Where do I go? Where do I sit? Who do I talk to? How do I contact my legislator?
Where do I park?
Once you actually get up there, you would be amazed how helpful
Yeah.
the guards are to make sure that you can actually contact your legislator and give you some ability to get involved in the process.
So where to park is a really good notion because I'm cognizant of how email is quick and easy and bullet points are good and short and sweet, so good communication skills. But there's also constituents who don't have cars, who are in wheelchairs, who don't have the technological skills to use computer or don't have broadband at home, who would have to go to the library or somewhere else. And so it seems to me we have a large group of people who don't get heard from or just don't know the process or are afraid to get up and speak. And when we come back on Community Roundtable, I want to ask about representing those folks, the disenfranchised. This is Community Roundtable. We'll be back with Lincoln Shurtz and former Senator Carlene Walker. Keep it tuned. We are back on Community Roundtable with Lincoln Shurtz and former Senator Carlene Walker. And I want to ask about this notion of lobbying from the people who are often considered the most disenfranchised. And it seems to me that among some groups of seniors, there's far more technological ability than maybe we might think. I mean, we all know the joke about the kid having to program the DVR for the parent, but what's your experience specifically in terms of hearing from folks who don't have the ability to hire a Lincoln or another contract lobbyist? How does that work for those folks, the folks on Medicaid or the folks who really need government help?
Well, I would often get hard copy letters from them.
Okay.
But as I said, as years went along, the years that I was there, I saw a decided increase of those types of people who would email, and they would also call me, and sometimes they would email me and then follow up with a call, and say, now, you know, I asked you about this issue, and I told you about this circumstance. They also organize. You know, the AARP is very well organized. The veterans.
Nationwide or in Utah, they are everywhere? Okay.
Both.
Good to know.
Yeah. They have their own attorneys, they have their own lobbyists, and they have a day on the Hill where senior citizens come up and you know, as I would go to national meetings with other legislators, they would be floored at the fact that there was a desk outside the chamber, and they would make out their little blue notes, and at a minimum of 15 minutes every day, the legislators would come out before their lunch break, and also in and out off and on of the floor. And if you're in the gallery and you don't realize what's happening, those people are being pulled out often by constituents saying, "I want a piece of your time." And that doesn't happen in other states.
Interesting.
One of the biggest keys, not necessarily related just to the disenfranchised population, but just generally speaking, I think a lot of folks don't engage in the process of the legislature or in government until they want something. And this notion that you only call when you want something, it's the old axiom of everything you should have learned in life you learn in kindergarten. Don't just call when you need something. Be a part of the process throughout the entire year. If you have a sincere interest in Medicaid, be a part of the process. Understand how they got to where they're at, so that when you come, you're informed on what's going on, why they got to this point, and then certainly your position and the influence that you have in the process is going to be that more impactful.
And for folks who have the ability to do that, that's great. For the folks working 3 jobs, maybe not so much.
Yeah.
But Lincoln, just for a case study perhaps, the largest K through 12 classes in the nation, lowest per pupil funding in the nation, and on and on. And I wonder, as someone from the Utah League of Cities and Towns, tell me about education lobbying up on the Hill. Are you involved in that at all, or is that separate from the league?
It's separate from the league, but obviously education is a significant issue for the state legislature. It's the largest piece of the state budget and takes in an inordinate amount of time in the legislative process to figure out what the state's going to do. Getting over the hurdle of funding is going to be a significant issue for the state of Utah, simply because we have a lot of children and we don't have that many taxpayers.
And children aren't so good at lobbying, right?
Exactly.
So they need adults, yeah.
And when you don't have as many taxpayers as you do children, all of a sudden the funding dynamic gets a little strained. And I think Utah's always going to have an issue with comparing ourselves to other states when it comes to per pupil funding, just based on the number of taxpayers we have. The education lobby has come up considerably, obviously, with charter schools coming on the forefront. The Charter School Association has created a new lobbying association to make sure that their interests are being heard. Obviously, the Utah Education Association and others continue to lobby the state legislature for enhanced funding,
The
lower
school
class
choice
size.
folks.
School choice folks are obviously there as well.
Carlene.
I would say on that subject that that your inference that the education community is at all handicapped in terms of their lobbying, I would say just the opposite. Probably the education lobby is one of the more powerful.
So,
And if you look this year, a new group of business leaders called Prosperity 2020 came out and
Yes.
said, hey, as the business community, we see an interest in enhanced funding in both higher
right,
and
the
public
Chamber
ed.
in
The
Salt Lake
Chamber,
City
yeah.
and elsewhere are now
Yeah.
pushing for
Yeah.
education
Very
chances.
strong lobby. And
Do you think they'll get listened to? The business
absolutely.
lobby will get listened
They
more
are being
to than
listened
the UEA?
Yes.
Yeah.
In a word, yes.
Right. So we have
Because economic
yeah.
development in this state is really very high on the priority list. It has been for every governor that I can remember. And the argument is that education is tied inextricably to economic development, and I think that is
Right.
becoming clearer and clearer. And I think that the Chamber and Prosperity 2020 are really hitting that hard.
And we certainly hear that from the governor, right? That economic
Yes.
development will lead to better schools,
Yes.
and you could really make a chicken and egg argument. But I think we need a whole other half hour for that, and I'd love to talk with that again. But real quickly, we've only got a couple minutes left, so if I can, do you see a connection between, because many citizen groups are concerned about this, and I wanted to ask, a connection between campaign finance reform and lobbying reform? Do you see a connection in those issues?
Possibly. I don't know. I think that there is an upper end of huge donations that have been in the news in the last few weeks that are so out of the norm for the regular legislator. The regular legislator gets, I think the maximum I ever got was $5,000, and that was unusual.
That's a lot.
That's a lot, but that's unusual. But you know, I guess that that if you got a huge donation, you would be impacted by by that. But I think the notion that is the rule rather than the exception.
Well, it's the exceptions that people are concerned about, right?
But I would hope that that people know that their legislator, their own legislator, and the legislature in general is most likely very honest and not impacted by these huge amounts of money.
We can hope.
Well, having been
We
there,
can hope.
there,
Yeah.
I will tell you that they are a wonderful, dedicated group of people who are honest, and there's always an exception to the rule, but that is an exception.
So real quick, I only got about a minute left. What changes would you like to see? I mean, you're up there doing this. Any changes, ethics?
On campaign finance or ethics?
No, on I'm thinking specifically in terms of lobbying, rules, regulations, ethics. What do you see going on that you'd like to change? And I know we're almost out of time.
Generally speaking, I try not to get involved in those issues because obviously I have an inherent conflict of interest associated with that. On the ethics, if you look across the nation at what states are doing, there's a wide array of how states handle both campaign finance as well as ethics. And I can't think of a single state that hasn't had the perception of issues associated with ethical misconduct. So from that standpoint, I don't know if there is necessarily a right answer. The state could certainly do more. Other states have done more on campaign finance, whether it be limiting corporate donations or limiting the amount of an individual donation. But again, those are decisions that the policymakers need to make sure that the public has confidence in the process. I think at the end of the day, if that's the guiding post of are we making sure that the public has confidence in this process, we're going to be well served by our legislature.
That would be great. So we're going to have to leave it there. Lincoln Shurtz from the Utah League of Cities and Towns, you are their Legislative Affairs Director. You are the lobbyist up on the Hill.
Thank you.
And former Senator Carlene Walker, thank you very much for your time.
I appreciate
My
it.
Nice
pleasure.
to be with you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Community Roundtable. If you have comments, if you have questions, if you have suggestions for any of our future programs, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address, simply roundtable@slcctv.com. Simple as that. Thanks again to our guests today, Carlene Walker, Lincoln Shurtz. I'm Nic Burns. Keep it tuned to SLCC TV.